All right. It is an absolute pleasure, a big honor to have with us Dr. Jola Ajibade. Dr. Jola Ajibade is an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Sciences at Emory University, United States. She is an environmental and human geographer whose work focuses on climate risk, urban disasters, uneven resilience, climate migration, energy transitions, and societal transformation. Our research applies environmental justice and political ecology perspectives to climate adaptation and urban resilience, including and not limited to managing retreats, future cities, blue-green infrastructure, and renewable energy systems. And through her scholarship, she contributes to debates on equitable and transformative climate adaptation and social and political dimensions of environmental change. Dr. Ajibade, such an absolute pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Ashimowo, for inviting me to join the symposium. I also want to thank, the Green Institute as a whole, everyone working behind the scene. Thank you so much for your work. And thank you to the panelists that spoke before me. I think I learned a lot. And some of the things I will be sharing definitely connects back to what 2 or 3 of the earlier speakers have said. So thank you for sharing your knowledge. Today, I want to talk a little bit more and sort of bringing some issues together, especially in the context of cascading disasters and accelerating displacement, thinking about how do we build just resilience, and also how do we ensure adaptive futures. As you all know, we're entering into a century that is not only defined by one single climate disaster, right? There are multiple cascading rates, from floods to heat wave to wildfires, droughts, infrastructure failure, migration pressure, economic shocks, and all of these things actually interact and they reinforce another, right? And around the world, communities are being asked to adapt. We've talked a lot about resilience and adaptation this morning. In some cases, people have to relocate, they have to rebuild, and that's all important. But it's not always easy to do. And so even some adaptation strategies, including migration issue, can sometimes reproduce inequalities, and it can lead to new forms of displacements. So the big question, at least before us, and as I've been thinking about it in my work, is no longer how can we adapt, but how do we do it in a way that is truly just? How do we ensure the dignity of every individual that may have to, there are currently going through these challenges? And how do we build collective well-being? So those are bigger issues, and I will try to address some of this in my talk. And before I go into my quick agenda, I just want to say, based on the work that I've been doing and my research in different cities, from Manila to Lagos to Atlanta to Portland and several other places, some of the issues that I'm seeing have led me to this conclusion that we're certainly, and that's definitely from other climate reports as well, some of the work from IPCC too, which I was a part of. You were likely to see more cascading disasters. So it's a given because of the changes in climate, and also because we're not doing enough on mitigation efforts. And we're also likely to see climate displacement increase. That's on one end. On the other end, people are resilient, right? People have innovation, as we've seen. There are different ideas and agenda on how to move things forward. And I do believe that communities that invest in social cohesion, in infrastructure, in collective capacity, and particularly doing it in a just way, will likely be more resilient. And for the next generation of climate leaders, I think it will be important for us all, including the future generations that will be joining this work we're all doing. We will have to go beyond thinking about and working on recovery after the disaster and thinking about how do we build just resilience as a form of transformation. In this sense, I mean transforming the system that makes people vulnerable in the first place. So I wanted to put that out there. So I'll go quickly to explain what do I mean by cascading disaster. I'll talk about that and why it's important and give some examples of where this is happening. And quite frankly, it's happening in many parts of the world. And then I'll talk about some of the opportunities and gaps at the international and local levels, and then some future directions that I've learned from communities where I'm working and I've worked in the past as well. So bringing all of that together. So when we talk about cascading disasters, right, there is no single definition. People have all kinds of definition. But one of the prominent one in the academic scholarship is where you have one major disaster or major hazard that then has multiple triggers. So like a domino effect, something leads to several other things. And there are other definitions where people talk about consecutive events, where one event does not necessarily have the direct biophysical connection to the other, but they still happen. So you may have a flood in the month of June, and then heat wave in August, and then a wildfire in September. So that could also happen where you cannot even link the factors that led to them. But these are happening, and they tend to overwhelm the capacity of cities, the capacity of local government to respond, and certainly the capacity of communities to respond in a way that they can resist that event. So that's why it's a challenge, a big challenge. And so in some literature, you may see it look like this, where you have, climate change being a big driver, then you have the extreme events, then you have flood, you have displacement. So it could be in this direction. And some examples of this include, for example, the April 2022 flood events in Durban, where more than 300 millimeters of rain occurred in 24 hours. That's huge. And that triggered not only flooding, of course, but also landslide, which claimed more than 459 lives. So almost 500 people died from that event. It destroyed 4,000 homes. And then more than 40,000 people, just because of this connecting event, were homeless. People in informal settlements particularly suffered from this event. There was also sanitation infrastructure destroyed. There was contamination of water, and there was disease outbreak, as one would imagine or expect. But also the event itself, this chain of events, cost more than $2 billion. So these things are happening, and the question is, how do we deal with it? So that's just an example from Durban. Similarly, in Lagos, in fact, a lot of my PhD work was trying to understand the vulnerability to flooding. And this, more recently, we're seeing this happening almost every 2 years. So in September 2022 and July 2024, massive rainfall as well, leading to flooding, transportation disruption, power outages, business disruption, disease outbreak, and costing a lot of money, both for not just the city, but also for small businesses and certainly for local communities. In Freetown, somebody mentioned earlier today about issues around deforestation, which happens not because of climate per se, but because also of human interventions in nature. And, because you want to build homes, you want to make a life, all kinds of reasons can lead to deforestation, but that also makes the natural environment vulnerable. And then there's this heavy rain that occurred in Freetown, and then you had a landslide, and then displacement of people. So we're seeing this cascading events occur more often. However, it is important for us to also understand that these events do not exist in isolation of what is going on around the world, right? So we're seeing, if we zoom out a little bit, outside of the city scale, and then try to look at what's going on nationally and also internationally, we're seeing that climate change, as important as it is, that it's a driver of many things, it's not the only challenge we're facing collectively. We have increasing food security in many parts of Africa, and certainly in Latin America as well. We're seeing corruption all over the world. And this is not just, a case of one country or the other. Even in the US, where I live, there's massive corruption going on. We're seeing geopolitical tensions, a lot of war going on between superpowers and people and other, medium power countries. We're seeing violent conflicts. Obviously, we just came out of the pandemic in 2020, and some of the after effects, people are still experiencing that. We're seeing democratic backsliding as well as economic downturn. And all of those things are simultaneously interacting with the experience of disasters that people are going through. And therefore, it's not always, that easy to say for communities, you just need to adapt, because they are going through so many issues at the same time. And the question is, how do we enable resilience in a world where we're going through multi-crisis, right? How do we build community agency and activity and ability to be able to respond, early warning system that'll be effective. So those are big things to think about. I'll just put it there for now, but I wanted to draw a clear connection between this poly crisis and also in places where it's just so evident that this is a massive challenge. So if you take what's going on in Sudan and even South Sudan as well, we're seeing political instability that has some roots locally, but also globally. Then also we see armed conflict and then mass displacement happening, flooding at the same time, disease outbreak, and humanitarian crisis. And so it's become a case of when we're thinking about resilience, we need to think about what needs to change locally and globally simultaneously, and how do we help community respond. If we look at what the internal Displacement Monitoring Center shows us, this is from their 2025 report, we can see the number of displacements globally is increasing. So if you look at 2016, about 38.9 million people were displaced, but the rates is continuing to increase, and so is the number of displacements as well. And in 2025, more than 82.2 million people displaced, some due to climate effect, others due to conflict as well. So we need to take a lot of this issue, this crisis, together in how we're thinking, how do you build resilience? And there are specific regions where we're seeing this intersection of conflict-induced displacement and climate-induced displacement coming together. There's a convergence. And this this map you see before you is by the UNHCR 2023 report. And you can see in some region, it's more than 100,000 people being displaced, in some cases more than 500,000 people. So it's a lot that we're seeing, some of which is driven by drought, flood, but a lot also by conflict. And there are times that communities going through this it's not just about displacement, they are also trying to find safety. They are trying to move to places where they think they may get some stability and access to livelihood and school for their children, and transportation, just some form of semblance of basic life. But when they do that, something else then happens, particularly when they're trying to move internationally. Locally, there's a lot of those, like the 82.2 million movement I showed you from the IDMC. Most of those are internal mobility. People don't necessarily just try to go abroad. So I just wanted to put that caveat out. A lot of the displacement happens internally, and there are some where people try to move internationally. But then we're seeing that when people try to move internationally, we're seeing a lot of secularization happening at not only at the United States level, we're seeing it in the case of Europe as well, where there is this increase around borders, reinforcing this colonial tool of borders and bordering, where we're not taking into consideration why are people moving in the first place? Are we addressing climate change? Are we addressing the root causes of displacement such that people will want to build resilience in their country and not move? And most of the time when people are moving, it's not because they want to leave their family. Actually, most people want to stay home. It's when they don't have the resources anymore. When it becomes so hard to adapt locally, that's when people start to move. But when they start to do that, we then see the mobility of people is criminalized, right? They are thrown in the jails, as we're seeing is happening in the US. You were seeing the exploitation of children also. We're seeing human trafficking intersect as well with mobility challenges. We're seeing increasing marginalization, where even when people get to countries they want to go to, getting access to food, access to housing becomes a challenge. And so we're seeing this cycle of dispossession come together with also issues of displacement and with issues of climate mobility. And so mobility, as is emerging, we're seeing it that is treated as a territorial issue and in humanitarian crisis in a way that we don't want them to come. It's also framed as a political threat rather than seen as a human response to adaptation, and that needs to change. And on the global level, there are huge gaps that I think we also need to rethink. And I believe one of the speakers, it might have been Dr. Leon, mentioned is that we need a different agenda. First, I want to prefix that, yes, things like sustainable development goals, the Sendai framework, the Paris Agreement, the Global Compact, when you read this visioning document, this agenda, they look good on paper. But a lot of people have said today, how do we move from what looks good on paper to action to implementation? That's one issue. And there are efforts to implement these things in different countries at local level. But one of my own biggest struggle with this, and which is why I say these agendas are no longer enough, is because some of these things are not designed for a 21st century poly-crisis era, which is where we are right now. Some of them are designed assuming that the political and economic climate or economic order will be stable. But we've come to an order where there is no order, so to speak. Countries are acting in selfish ways for their own national interests, and they're not thinking about the larger and the benefits for particularly those who have been marginalized. And even for me, I do think, a lot of people mention the United Nations today. If you think about it, the Security Council, for all intents and purposes, does not really exist. They exist on paper, but they are not doing the best to ensure that the UN itself is a strong institution that can meet the challenges of this century. We're not doing that, and that needs to change. Well, I don't know if it's about just needing a new agenda or needing to change the institution itself so that it can meet the needs of people in this movement. And it's a very complex need that we're going through. So that's on one end at the power level at the United Nations and policymakers at that level. There are other things that I think is important to also think about. There are so many other actors that also come into play, right? Some of them also use climate change normative discourses to advance their goal, right? So we have actors where some attend United Nations COP meetings, as we've seen in the case of, I think it was Qatar, where that meeting was also being used to debate and to discuss fossil fuel negotiations, which was sad. We see the financialization of nature where things like carbon credits, bioprospecting is benefiting corporations and wealthy groups rather than local communities. We're seeing green growth, which in some ways could work, but when you think about things like solar, hydrogen, or even wind, some benefits have gone to local communities that I've worked with and talked to, but a lot of the resources is concentrated in the hands of powerful groups, in the hands of corporations. That needs to change. We're also seeing, particularly in cities where gentrification is happening, communities are being displaced, and using the language of climate change to co-opt the system. Yet they are accumulating a lot of resources for themselves, where they're building this mansion on water. We're seeing, increase in state control. And all of these are different actors, and some of them intersect with, powerful people at the global level. How do we address these issues are also important. But in the middle, if you see, there's a link here that says strategic discourse mobility, discourse mobilization. And so there are other scholars who are calling for a degrowth. Like, how do we change from just the fossil fuel economy to an economy that is actually based on fostering care and resources and a circular system, right? How do we ensure reparations for communities? How do we give, funding for communities experiencing loss and damages because of climate change? How do we ensure land back? So these are key things that I think, as we do a research, as we work with communities and we work with governments as well as policymakers, how do we move from an exploitative global system to a system that would really work for everyone while addressing climate change? Fairly recently, I actually picked this from LinkedIn, where the Secretary General of United Nations, that's Antonio Guterres, it's a man I respect and I really admire so much, said those least responsible for climate change are paying the highest price. That injustice must end. I think everybody knows this. So it's not something new. And this is something that was, this statement is saying was pushed by the advisory, as an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. Absolutely important, absolutely relevant. But the question, can we move beyond advisory opinion? How do we really translate these ideas and opinion and agenda into something that really makes a difference on the ground? What would climate justice really mean across countries and within countries? How do we end making particular countries and communities a sacrifice zone for the impacts of climate change? How do we build resilience? We've been talking a lot about resilience today. How do we really make these things meaningful communities while also ensuring just transition, environmental justice, adaptation that doesn't displace people, but also global visions that really can translate into local realities? I think that is the key points we are in the global discourse, but also in local context. How do we make this really meaningful? And from the work that I have been doing, just talking to people locally, these are things that I'm thinking, what would a just resilience mean? As you're facing this cascading risk in the context of a poly crisis, what would just really look like? And I spoke to communities, like I mentioned earlier, in Lagos, Manila, just sort of bringing together all of things I've been learning from these communities. And the key thing people really want is a system that is transformed or that can be transformed, right? They're not just thinking about bouncing back after a disaster or just, implementing certain disaster risk strategies, which are important. They really want development that is people-oriented, that is inclusive and bottom-up, that is evidence-based on anticipatory and adaptive governing and planning, that increases social cohesion, proper retreat plans when people have to move. They don't mind to move, but you have to do it in a way that really centers people's needs, including needs for affordable housing, need for even ecosystem restoration is important to people. A lot of people mentioned that, increasing vegetation, robust planning, all of those things is what people say they want. These are people in low-income communities, some local expert telling us this is where they want to go. And we also see where they don't want to go. That's the maladaptation side. They don't want just a growth-oriented development. They don't want just, climate reclamation projects. And I will try to wrap up. I suspect my time is almost up, so I'll wrap up soon. And there was a research that was done here in US to talk to people about how do you envision urban imaginaries to look like in the 21st century. And a lot of people said so many things, which I can answer in question time. But many mentioned that they want connected cities. They want cities that also center ecosystems viability. They want a city that is just, a city that is caring. All of these things I think will be important as we take those ideas from the low-income communities that I've talked about, also the visioning that other people are saying, and bring them together. And I promise this is my last slide. So if we bring those local visions and needs together with what we also need to do at the global level, some of these key issues pop out for me as levers for change for transformative futures, right? Thinking when we're planning locally or even globally, we have to think about these issues at a systems approach, but also a holistic systems approach. Going beyond growth or even embracing degrowth, I think might be important. And also embracing regenerative economies locally, while also doing this in a way that ensures justice and adaptive governance, and really centering care will be important moving forward. Thank you all again for listening. Certainly happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ajibade, for such powerful presentation. A lot of comments in the comment section. Some of the participants would like to have a copy of your presentation and even a video.
Absolutely.
Like watch. We will post
it
on the Green Institute's YouTube platform after the conference. I think the question I have for you is, when adaptation itself can sometimes produce new forms of displacement or inequality, how can governments ensure that climate resilience projects protect vulnerable communities, such as some of the communities that you've shared in your presentation, rather than unintentionally pushing them further to the margins?
Yeah, that's an important question. And this I'm going to give a grounded example. So when we say when adaptation can lead to displacement, in places where I've seen adaptation lead to displacement, like some of the coastal communities in Lagos where I worked with, the project that actually led to those displacement was a project that is a public-private partnership. So we see the governments also involved in that displacement, but on the outside, it looked like it's just a private company that is building mega project. And that's where the government itself needs to change its stance. You can't just implement projects, whether it's floating cities or new cities, whatever it may be called. They have to make provision for local and particularly informal settlers. Those are the ones that tend to be displaced a lot, where these communities are actually given an alternative housing. I've seen this happen in Manila, where before any relocation happens, houses are prepared and then communities are given resources to move there. And this is also happening in the US, where people are given resources for what we call retreat. And so the displacement would reduce when the government takes a proactive measure to actually provide affordable housing for communities, rather than reacting after the displacement has happened. So I think that's a key, but also ensuring a moratorium of some kind on housing increases, like rent increases, where communities can actually find affordable rents in their preferred location rather than forcing them to move outside of the city, which most local individuals or households do not want to do.
Thank you very much. And just to follow up to that, you spoke about cascading disasters where floods, heat waves, infrastructural failure, economic shocks, and displacement interacts and reinforce one another. So for cities like Lagos or other rapidly growing African city, what practical system, and I'm sure you've kind of touched on this, but question from the other, should we put in place now so that urban resilience planning respond to this connected risk rather than treating disasters as isolated events?
Right, that's an important question, and that's $1 million question, to be honest, because a lot of the planning, and this is not peculiar to Lagos, if you look at visioning documents, disaster risk management plans, it's still very much siloed. So it's like, this is how we respond to flood, this is how we respond to east, this is how we respond to wildfires or snowstorm or whatever. And what we're advocating for in some of the papers that I'm writing right now is we need to look at this aspect holistically, where you're bringing, the flood experts together with the heat experts, together with the people who are doing transportation, with those who are building and helping with urban development, and having them in the same room to plan for how do you respond when you have a disaster with a chain of events. How do different practitioners in this different field come together to respond? I would say a lot of planning, hazard planning and climate adaptation plans, the better one is the climate adaptation plans do tend to take some of these things into consideration, but the hazard mitigation group do not really, they do it in silos. And so we need the climate adaptation planners and practitioners and the hazard mitigation group to come together in a room and foresee, like if this were to happen in this chain of events, what are the skill sets we need? What are the technology, the critical infrastructure we need to protect very quickly? How do we move people if they need to evacuate very quickly? So I think we need documents to help us, the policies to help us, but we also need to train people and to build capacity for responders locally to be able to address these challenges. But because it's going to happen more often going into the future.
Thank you, Dr. Ajibade. One last question. I was particularly struck by your point that many global climate and developed agendas look good on paper, but they don't always, they're not always designed for polling crisis realities of the 21st century. So what would a truly justice-centered global climate agenda look like, especially for communities that are facing both climate-induced displacement and conflict-induced displacement?
Okay, so to make sure I got your question, I think you said, what would a just climate agenda look like for communities that are facing a climate displacement and conflict displacement?
Yeah, so okay. What will a truly justice-centered global climate agenda, what would it look like?
Oh my God, whoever asked that question, that's a brilliant question. And definitely it's a paper I think I should write with people. But yeah, this is something that is so important, in part because some of the factors that shape the conflict displacement are very much different from the factors that shape the climate, but the effects come together, right? The impacts come together. And so I think we would need experts working on conflict issues or in conflict regions, including from Afghanistan, to Sudan, even, to Ukraine. There are different factors that, like in Ukraine right now, people are going through that, where they are living a life of conflict, but they're also experiencing the impact of climate change. And so we need experts that are very much knowledgeable in the conflict zone to understand what are the factors that are shaping the impact on people's lives, but also those who are working in the climate-induced space, like you, like me, and other people, and say, where do we find this intersection? How do we build a decolonial approach to how we address these issues, right? Some of the challenges that I have found in my work is that many of the people who design climate agendas, adaptation, whatever, tend not to be the ones that are going through it. They tend to be, people who do the lit review and write, which is fine. We do need experts, but we need to bring the communities that are also experiencing this challenge into the room. So somebody mentioned co-production earlier in the meeting today. And I think we're bringing the community together to tell about their experiences, the challenges, and co-producing those visioning documents will be another key way to think about a justice-centered approach. But we also need to bring what we call, for me, because I think women's perspective are often marginalized in this spaces, so bringing a feminist, decolonial, but also a care-based approach. an approach that centers, caring for one in truly meaningful way, not just in, in discursive way, but in really in ways that can lead to a relational understanding of this issue, but also a relational way to change the system. I think those are some of the things that we need to do. But it has to happen both at the local level, the national level, and also the global level. And I think there should be an agenda on this topic for sure. It's just a fascinating question to me. Yeah.
Thank you very much once again. Someone in the chat said that you're so passionate about this topic, and that you should
Yes.
get out. And this presentation is very timely, and so your contributions has helped us understand that climate change is not only an environmental challenge, but also a question of justice, a question of dignity, a question of displacement, and unequal vulnerability. So just to wrap up for our audience, I think the major takeaway from your presentation is that adaptation must not become another source of harm, and climate resilience project must protect people first, especially those in informal settlements, coastal communities, and other high-risk urban spaces. So rather than just pushing them further into insecurity or exclusion. I think also that your presentation has reminded us that disasters are rarely isolated. So talking about flooding, heat, infrastructural failure, poverty, and conflicts, and lots of other, conflict displacement often interacts in ways that deepens existing inequalities. So this means that resilient cities must be planned with justice at the center, at the core, ensuring that vulnerable communities are not only protected, but also heard and included in decision making. And we also talk about even in some like coastal communities, for instance, that are facing the impacts of climate change. There's been a lot of advocating for, some of the people in the communities, the women, the youth, they should be even co-designers, even co-authors.
Right.
Such as they go to these communities, they take their data, they take their samples, and then they get the credit for the authorship. But the real they have that local solutions. So they might not be able to write academic language or academic papers, but they can also be co-authors or co-design. So their knowledge can be credited. So thank you once again, Dr. Ajibade, for bringing such a strong justice perspective to this symposium. We appreciate your time, we appreciate your scholarship, and your contributions to this edition of the 2026 World Environment Day Symposium that is proudly hosted by the Great Institute. And we look forward to collaborating with you more and more. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you. Thank you.
You'll have a lovely day.